The concept of loss. It sounds so simple, right? Something ends, something's gone. We often think of grief in, well, one very specific way, usually tied to the death of a loved one.
Right, that's the common association.
But what if that idea, that sort of ingrained perception, is actually just the tip of a much larger iceberg? What if grief is much broader, much more, universal than we've ever imagined?
That's precisely where our journey begins today. Welcome, everyone, to this deep dive. We're going to unpack a stack of really fascinating sources, psychological models, cultural insights, clinical research.
Yeah, a real mix.
All designed to help us understand this often misunderstood human experience.
Our mission today really is to explore the surprising breadth of grief. We want to challenge those traditional ideas about moving on and, crucially, offer you practical, research-backed strategies for navigating its, well, incredibly complex landscape.
Yeah, the hope is you'll gain a richer understanding of not just what grief is, but maybe why it shows up in so many different ways.
And how people, across different cultures, different situations, find their own paths through it.
So start by expanding our understanding of what actually counts as grief, moving way beyond just the death of a loved one.
Okay.
Then we'll dive into different theoretical models from the really well-known stages.
Kubler-Ross, everyone knows that one.
Exactly. To more modern, dynamic perspectives that offer, frankly, new ways of looking at the whole process.
And we'll also delve into something really surprising, I think. The intricate connection between grief and your very sense of self, your identity.
It's a huge piece. And finally, we want to equip you with a powerful toolkit of practical strategies, things like mindfulness, relaxation,
And narrative therapy, which sounds really interesting.
yes, to help you navigate these complex, often pretty overwhelming emotions.
Okay, so we promised to challenge some old ideas about grief. Let's start right there.
Yeah.
What if grief isn't just about losing a person? What if it's woven into so much more of our lives? One of our sources puts forward this fascinating idea, the everything is grief thesis. It suggests that if you really boil down a lot of our pain, when you get to the core of it, it often contains elements of the grieving process.
It's really about adjusting, isn't it? Adjusting to any change or loss that just disrupts our fundamental sense of stability.
That's a profound shift in how we might think about everyday struggles.
It really is. We are, we're kind of wired for stability, for predictability. And when that gets disrupted, our whole system reacts.
And this isn't just about the big, obvious losses, right?
Not at all. It's about the adjustment to any significant transition, even sometimes a seemingly positive one, that can trigger a form of grief for what was, for the familiar comfort that's suddenly gone.
That makes so much sense when you start listing examples. It's not just bereavement. We can grieve the loss of identity, for instance.
Definitely.
Think about becoming a parent. Your old self, your spontaneous schedule, your social life, it shifts dramatically.
Or retirement, huge one. Your professional identity, your daily routine, maybe even your sense of purpose can just vanish.
Yeah. Or even a major illness. That can mean grieving the loss of your health, your physical abilities, maybe your whole vision for the future.
And think about changes in relationships. Divorce is an obvious one, of course, but so is a really significant friendship ending or children leaving home for college. You're not just saying goodbye to their constant physical presence.
Right. It's more than that.
You're often grieving the loss of a particular role you played, the routines you shared, maybe the future you'd pictured together.
And what about job transitions? Losing a job, obviously, that can be a massive source of grief. Loss of income, structure, colleagues, self-worth.
Huge impact.
But even starting a new job, something you wanted, a positive move, even that can bring up feelings of uncertainty, nostalgia for the old team, the old routine.
Absolutely. Or moving to a new place. You might grieve the loss of community, familiar surroundings, that sense of belonging. It's subtle sometimes, but it's still a loss.
And that really highlights why validating these experiences, all these different kinds of loss, is so crucial.
It absolutely is. And it's important to remember grief is a unique emotional response. It's distinct from anxiety or depression or trauma, even though, it can definitely contain elements of all three.
So it needs its own approach.
It needs to be treated as its own complex process. It's not just feeling sad or numb. It's a whole physiological and psychological adjustment happening.
Okay, that helps frame the broad scope. Now let's dig into some specific forms of grief that might surprise people. For instance, anticipatory grief, sometimes called preparatory grief. What's that about?
Anticipatory grief is, well, it's quite profound because it happens before an actual loss or death.
Before.
Yeah. It's very common among family members, friends of someone with a terminal illness, like Alzheimer's or advanced cancer. They're essentially grieving the future loss while the person is still physically present.
Wow. That sounds incredibly challenging. It's like living in two realities at once, isn't it?
It truly is, and it has this kind of dual nature. It can be both positive and negative.
How so?
Well, on the positive side, having this time, this anticipatory period, can actually spur people to make really meaningful choices.
Yeah.
It might encourage you to spend more quality time with your loved one, have those deep, meaningful conversations you always wanted to have, maybe say things you might otherwise leave unsaid. It can bring a sense of peace, even closure, before the loss actually occurs.
So it can be a catalyst for connection. That's a powerful, maybe unexpected silver lining.
It can be, yeah. But the negative side is equally potent, unfortunately. The stress of watching someone you love gradually slip away bit by bit, that can be overwhelmingly distressing.
I can only imagine.
It often brings intense feelings of helplessness, anxiety, just profound suffering.
And then there's another type you mentioned, one that sounds particularly isolating. Disenfranchised grief.
Yes, disenfranchised grief. This is when a loss is not, or perhaps cannot be, openly acknowledged, publicly mourned, or socially supported by others.
So it's like your grief is invisible or invalidated.
Exactly, and that lack of recognition often leads to deep isolation for the griever. It's a significant factor that really adds to vulnerability for more complex grief reactions later on.
Can you give us some examples of how this plays out? It sounds subtle but impactful.
Certainly. One really striking example is how different societies handle miscarriage and abortion. In many modern Western cultures, these losses are often just not formally acknowledged.
Right. There aren't really rituals or anything.
Precisely. No public rituals, no social scripts for expressing sorrow, which can leave parents feeling incredibly alone. Now, contrast that with Japan, where there's a Buddhist ritual called Mizuko Kuyo, specifically for these kinds of deaths.
Mizuko Kuyo.
Yeah, it allows parents to express guilt, gratitude, loss, potentially leading to a healthier resolution because it's acknowledged.
That's a huge difference. Just having that communal space, that recognition.
It makes a world of difference. Another example is, say, the death of a gay partner. While some groups and communities now recognize and mark such deaths, which is progress, it's still highly unlikely for those from more conservative backgrounds, perhaps religious ones, where the relationship itself might not have been acknowledged.
So again, the bereaved person is left without that clear path for social support, for public mourning.
Exactly. These examples just highlight how cultural expectations really shape grief. Which deaths get marked, how grief is expressed, who gets support.
And then we have survivor's guilt, which you mentioned is like a cousin to grief.
Yes, survivor's guilt. It's typically experienced by people who were adjacent to a loss but didn't directly experience it themselves.
So they feel guilty for having survived when others didn't.
Or for maybe not having done more, feeling they could have prevented it somehow. It's an emotional response that very frequently accompanies and complicates the grieving process. All these specific forms really emphasize that while loss is universal, the ways we respond show remarkable variation.
Okay, so when we talk about grief models, most people immediately think of the Kubler-Ross 5 stages.
The classic.
It's probably the most widely recognized framework out there, right? Introduced back in 1969. Describes 5 primary responses to loss.
Yes, it's a classic, and for good reason. It really gave people a language, a way to understand their emotional turmoil. The stages are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance.
Right.
But, and this is crucial, it's vital to emphasize that these stages are not linear. They're not neat steps you climb.
Okay, that's important.
Individuals can and often do cycle through them. They might return to previous stages or experience them in completely different orders. It's more like a map of potential emotional states than a prescribed journey.
Got it. So a compass, not a rigid pathway. Let's briefly touch on each stage then. First, denial. That initial shock.
Denial really serves as an initial buffer against the shock of the loss. It's a refusal to accept reality, in a way. In the immediate aftermath, it can actually help someone cope with overwhelming feelings.
Okay, then anger.
When reality starts to set in, anger often emerges. And this can be directed anywhere at oneself, at others, even at the person who died. It's a powerful expression of deep pain, frustration, and that feeling of helplessness.
After anger, bargaining.
This is where individuals might try to negotiate, maybe with a higher power or even just internally with their emotions, trying to somehow reverse or delay the loss. It reflects that deep desire to regain some kind of control.
Then comes the profound weight of depression.
Yeah, this stage involves deep sadness, despair, a sense of hopelessness, isolation. It signifies that the individual has really started to recognize and acknowledge the full weight of the loss.
And finally, acceptance. What does that really mean in this context?
Acceptance doesn't mean you're suddenly okay with the loss or that the pain is gone. Not at all. It means coming to terms with the reality of it, integrating the loss into your life story, and finding a way to move forward while still holding on to memories.
That's a really helpful overview of the classic model. But as you mentioned, grief theory has evolved quite a bit.
Oh, significantly.
Newer models seem to move away from that idea of a predictable emotional path, appreciating more complex patterns of adaptation.
Precisely. One of these evolving perspectives is William Worden's 4 Tasks of Mourning. What's fascinating here is how it contrasts with Kubler-Ross.
How so?
Well, while Kubler-Ross puts acceptance way at the end, Worden's model actually emphasizes acceptance as the first step in the mourning journey. That's a pretty significant shift in focus.
Okay, interesting. So what are the 4 tasks? First is accept the reality of the loss.
This is about acknowledging the loss intellectually and emotionally, understanding its finality. It's the foundational step, recognizing the person is gone and isn't coming back.
Second, experience the pain of grief.
This task encourages allowing oneself to fully feel and process all the emotions without suppressing them. It's vital to lean into those feelings, however painful, rather than trying to avoid them.
Third, adjust to a world without the deceased. This feels very practical.
It is very practical. It involves finding new routines, maybe taking on new roles, forming new relationships, basically realigning your life with this new reality. Losing someone often means losing parts of your daily life, aspects of your identity, plans for the future. This task is about actively rebuilding and adapting.
And finally, the 4th task. Find a way to remember the deceased.
This emphasizes maintaining a meaningful, ongoing connection with the person who died, through memories, rituals, honoring their life. It's not about letting go of the person, but about transforming the relationship and finding a lasting place for them in your ongoing life.
That seems to lead really nicely into the dual process model of grief by Strub and Schitt.
Yes, another really influential modern model.
This one feels like it captures something so many people describe about grief, that sort of back and forth feeling. Why is that oscillation so fundamental to this model?
It views grief as a dynamic process because you're not always in one state. You naturally move or oscillate between 2 primary orientations, loss-oriented phases and restoration-oriented phases.
Okay, loss-oriented and restoration-oriented. What's the difference?
In the loss-oriented phases, the focus is squarely on the grief itself. You know, the yearning, looking backward, maybe feeling resistance to change. Sometimes people hold the grief as something sacred, almost like a connection to the lost person.
I heard people describe that wanting to sit with their grief, almost protect it.
Precisely. And then you have the restoration-oriented phases. Here, the focus shifts toward moving forward, toward adapting to the changes brought by the loss.
So, like dealing with practicalities.
Dealing with practicalities, engaging in new activities, maybe welcoming distractions, looking toward the future. It's about rebuilding your life, figuring out how to function in this new world, even as the grief remains somewhere in the background.
And here's what I found truly eye-opening about this model. We often think of the pain of grief as the only stressor. But this research shows that even moving forward, even the restoration part, is profoundly draining.
That's such a crucial insight. The stress in the loss-oriented phase is obvious, right? The intense pain, the yearning, the sleepless nights, difficulty with basic chores. It's that overwhelming emotional wave that can hit you anywhere, like the source mentioning crying in Costco.
Yeah, very relatable image, unfortunately.
But the stress in the restoration-oriented phase is often really underestimated. It's the stress of figuring out new roles, a new identity, making decisions alone, adapting socially as a changed person. Even engaging in what might seem like fun activities can be incredibly draining, especially maybe for introverts who have to push themselves into social situations.
So even when you feel like you're doing better, maybe moving forward, you're still expending immense energy just navigating the new landscape.
Absolutely. And the model suggests that over time, these oscillations, this back and forth, tends to become less frequent and maybe less dramatic. That indicates a form of progression, of integration.
Okay. And that idea of integration leads us to another really groundbreaking theory, the continuing bonds theory.
Yes, this one directly challenges that very old, very ingrained notion that healthy grief requires letting go of the deceased.
This feels like a huge paradigm shift. For so long, the message was move on, find closure, which always implied, severing ties.
It directly opposes those older ideas, like Freud's, which suggested that to heal, you had to detach emotionally. Continuing bonds theory, introduced by Klass, Silverman, and Nickman back in '96, posits something quite different.
Which is?
That keeping a meaningful emotional relationship with the deceased is actually a healthy, adaptive part of bereavement for many people. It suggests that these bonds don't just disappear, they evolve over time. They transform.
So how do people maintain these bonds in a healthy way? What does that look like in practice?
Oh, it varies hugely. It can be as simple as talking to the deceased, privately or aloud, or holding on to meaningful objects, a piece of jewelry, a handwritten note, a favorite sweater.
Tangible connections.
Tangible connections. Engaging in rituals is another big one, celebrating anniversaries or birthdays, visiting special places. People also carry forward a loved one's values, maybe their work or passions, kind of extending their legacy. And for many, dreams and spiritual connections, feeling a deceased loved one's presence offer real emotional reassurance.
It's about integrating the loss, not erasing it.
Exactly. Integrating it into daily life in a healthy, meaningful way.
And for professionals, for therapists and counselors, this model must be incredibly beneficial.
Oh, it's transformative. It reduces so much guilt and anxiety for grieving individuals who worry that holding on is somehow unhealthy or wrong.
Because that was the old message.
It was. This shifts the focus from detachment to adaptation. It helps people find meaningful ways to keep connections alive. It also aligns beautifully with many cultural and spiritual beliefs that already embrace the idea of an ongoing connection with ancestors or spirits. And crucially, it encourages personalized grief support tailored to the individual's needs and beliefs.
This idea of meaning-making seems to be a really core thread running through these newer models.
Definitely.
And it's absolutely central to the meaning reconstruction model by Robert Niemeyer, isn't it?
It is, absolutely. This model frames grieving as an active process of meaning reconstruction. A major loss, it argues, profoundly perturbs one's assumptive world.
Assumptive world.
Yeah, think of it as the fundamental beliefs and expectations we hold about life, often unconsciously. The world is generally safe, life is fair, people you love stick around. It's the invisible blueprint you've always lived by.
Okay.
When a major loss hits, it's like that blueprint gets shredded. And you're left trying to figure out how to rebuild everything, how to make sense of a world that no longer fits your old assumptions.
So the goal isn't just to feel better, necessarily, but to rebuild a new understanding of the world and your place in it.
Exactly. It necessitates deep revisions in your sense of identity, your self-definition. Grievers are often thrust into this period of accelerated decision-making, actively choosing how to revise their life narratives, how to re-engage with the world based on this new reality. These evolving perspectives really offer a much richer, more nuanced understanding of grief than just linear stages. They emphasize adaptability, ongoing connection, and this active process of rebuilding meaning.
That brings us to a really fascinating and, I think, critical part of our deep dive, the intricate relationship between grief and identity.
A very close link.
Our sources highlight something called complicated grief, or CG, and how identity confusion is a central feature of it. First off, what exactly is complicated grief?
Okay, so complicated grief, it's also known sometimes as persistent complex bereavement disorder or prolonged grief disorder. It's basically a prolonged and debilitating grief reaction. It affects about 7% of bereaved adults.
So not the typical grief experience.
No, it's characterized by really intense yearning for the deceased, persistent emotional pain, and this kind of preoccupation with thoughts of the deceased and often the circumstances of their death. Unlike typical grief, which tends to lessen in intensity over time, CG remains severe and persistent, really impairing daily functioning.
And identity confusion is a hallmark of this condition. How does that work?
Yes, it's considered a central feature. It's this profound sense that a part of oneself has actually died with the person who died.
Wow.
This isn't just sadness, it's a fundamental disruption to who you perceive yourself to be. For example, if your entire life, your sense of purpose, maybe your social world was completely intertwined with another person, their loss leaves this massive void, not just in your life, but in yourself.
That makes sense.
And the empirical evidence backs this up. Studies show individuals with CG often have real difficulty imagining a future without the deceased. They report frequent counterfactual thoughts, those if-only thoughts like, I find myself wishing that things could be the way they were when I was with them.
That brings us to a very specific and insightful study, the Belay et al. Study from 2020. What did they discover about the nature of this identity confusion in complicated grief?
Yeah, this was a really interesting study using qualitative coding of self-descriptions. They asked people, I am, and analyzed the answers.
Okay.
And they found something really important. Identity confusion in CG seems to result from diminished self-complexity, meaning a narrowing of one's sense of self, not an expansion or confusion between multiple selves.
So people describe themselves in fewer ways, a more limited sense of self.
Exactly. They found two key things. Lower self-fluency, meaning individuals with CG made fewer overall self-descriptive statements, I am, completions. And maybe more significantly, lower self-diversity. They used fewer unique categories to describe themselves.
Fewer categories, like fewer roles or interests.
Right. Fewer different domains of identity. And self-diversity was actually a more significant predictor of CG severity than just the number of statements.
Huh. Why would that be?
Well, the study suggests that, and I'm quoting loosely here, a loss that substantively shuts off entire domains of one's life is more impactful than losing one aspect of an already well-rounded life.
Okay, so if your spouse was your partner, your best friend, and your only social connection, losing them eliminates multiple domains at once.
Exactly. Their absence could lead to the complete subtraction of a social self or a partner self, creating intense isolation and identity disruption. The task in recovery, therefore, might be about restoring or finding new domains of self-concept, rather than just adding more descriptors to already existing ones.
That's a really specific insight. What other specific self-concept differences did they find?
They found that individuals with CG describe themselves less in terms of self-relevant activity.
Fewer hobbies or things they do.
Yeah. And this links directly to that sense of meaninglessness and behavioral deactivation often seen in CG. The bereaved person engages in fewer meaningful activities, which then just makes the CG worse. It's a tough cycle.
Yeah.
They also had smaller proportions of references to personal preferences, their likes and dislikes.
Why might that be?
Well, the researchers speculated it could reflect anhedonia, that inability to feel pleasure common in depression and sometimes grief. Or perhaps their preferences were so deeply intertwined with the deceased, we like this, we did that they're now genuinely uncertain about their own preferences.
That's incredibly insightful. If your identity and preferences were sort of merged with another person, figuring out who you are alone must be a monumental task. What about the focus on the deceased? Did they find people with CG talked about them more in their self-descriptions?
Interestingly, while the CG group did show a 3 times higher prevalence of self-statements referencing the deceased, it wasn't statistically significant across all metrics in this particular study's analysis.
Oh, okay.
But crucially, this focus was associated with specific interpersonal difficulties in CG. Things like feeling distant from others, mistrustful, maybe even bitter towards people who haven't suffered a similar loss.
So the merged identity might make forming new social connections harder.
That's the suggestion. It seems that while maintaining a bond is healthy, as continuing bonds theory suggests, if the identity remains too fused, it might hinder the ability to connect with others in the present. This research provides a really fine-grained picture of identity confusion in complicated grief, offering specific targets for understanding and, potentially, support.
This deep dive has already given us so much to think about. I mean, from expanding our whole definition of grief to understanding its complex link with identity.
It's a lot to unpack.
It really is. Now let's pivot towards the practical side. What strategies and support are actually available for navigating this incredibly challenging experience?
Absolutely. A really important first step often is simply understanding and finding ways to express your emotions. Grief is physically and emotionally exhausting, so nurturing your emotional well-being is paramount. That means prioritizing self-care, even especially when it feels like the hardest thing in the world to do.
But how can someone even begin to identify what they're feeling when it often just feels like a big, jumbled mess of pain?
That's a great question. A very helpful tool here is something called the feelings wheel. Have you seen one of those?
I think so, yeah. Lots of words for feelings.
Exactly. It helps you recognize and communicate what you're experiencing. The inner circle might have primary feelings like mad, sad, scared, and then the outer rings break those down into more nuanced emotions like resentful or lonely or anxious.
Okay.
The idea is that simply naming an emotion, just putting a label on it, can help it lose some of its overwhelming power. Once you can name it, you can begin to acknowledge it and express it in healthy ways.
Like how?
Through writing, like journaling, maybe creating art, or simply talking to trusted friends, family, or of course professionals.
So if those emotions feel really overwhelming, what are some practical coping mechanisms people can use in the moment?
Grounding techniques are incredibly useful when you feel flooded or disconnected. They help calm your mind and body by bringing you back to the present moment, focusing on your senses.
Like the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 thing.
Exactly. The 5-4-3-2-1 senses exercise is a classic. Name 5 things you can see, 4 things you can physically feel, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing you can taste. It effectively shifts your focus from that internal turmoil to your external reality.
That's a good one to have in your back pocket.
Yeah.
And what about relaxation techniques? Breathing seems key.
Breathing is fundamental. There are several simple yet really effective breathing exercises. For instance, deep belly breathing, also called diaphragmatic breathing. You inhale deeply through your nose, letting your belly expand, and then exhale slowly through your mouth.
Right.
There's also 4-7-8 breathing, where you inhale for 4, hold for 7, exhale for 8, or box breathing, inhale 4, hold 4, exhale 4, hold 4. These are powerful, simple tools to regulate your nervous system when you feel overwhelmed.
Okay, so naming feelings, grounding, breathing, these are all crucial parts of self-care. But self-care itself, like you said, in the midst of grief, can feel like an impossible task.
It truly can. It often falls way down the priority list when you're just trying to get through the day, but it's vital. We often think of self-care as, bubble baths and luxury.
Yeah, kind of fluffy sometimes.
But during grief, it's a necessity. It's basic maintenance for survival. And it helps to think of it holistically. Our sources outline a great comprehensive plan.
Across different areas of life.
Exactly. Physical, eating as well as you can, trying to get sleep, maybe some gentle exercise, keeping up with medical checks. Emotional, allowing positive activities, acknowledging small accomplishments, healthy emotional expression. Spiritual, whatever that means for you. Maybe inspirational reading, self-reflection, nature, meditation, exploring spiritual connections.
Okay, that makes sense. What else?
Professional, finding meaning in work if possible, striving for balance, positive coworker relationships, managing time. Social, nurturing healthy relationships, making time for supportive family friends, crucially, asking for support when you need it.
Asking is hard.
So hard. Also financial. Understanding your finances, budgeting, planning this can be a huge stressor after a loss. And psychological. Making time for yourself, maybe disconnecting from devices sometimes, learning new skills eventually, and considering professional counseling. It's about finding small, consistent ways to refuel across all these aspects.
That's a really helpful, broad framework, not just bubble baths. Now let's get into some specific therapeutic strategies, particularly those that use narrative. This sounds like a very active, meaning-making kind of approach.
It is. The core idea is that personal writing and exploring your own narrative can be incredibly powerful tools for reflection, integration, and that meaning reconstruction we talked about.
Like telling your own story.
In a way, yes, it's a writerly approach, meaning it uses the power of putting your thoughts, feelings, and experiences into words. It helps you shape your own story of loss and adaptation, even if you've never thought of yourself as a writer. These are often collaborative efforts with a counselor, always respecting your privacy and readiness.
Can you give us some specific examples of these narrative strategies from the sources?
Certainly. One strategy mentioned is creating epitaphs.
Like for a gravestone?
Well, yes, but it doesn't have to be literally carved in stone. The process of finding a concise inscription, a sentence or phrase that captures the meaning of a relationship or a life can be incredibly focusing and affirming.
Ah, I see.
Our sources share Karen's story. She struggled for months after her severely disabled son, Kenny, died. She couldn't find the right words. Finally, she came across a sentence that just clicked. Sometimes the richest things can come into our lives from places we would never choose to go. Finding that epitaph, even just for herself, brought her a profound sense of clarity and closure about his place in her life. The caution here, though, is not to rush it. Trying to condense complex meaning too quickly can feel invalidating.
That's beautiful. And then there are journals, which are a very common recommendation for dealing with tough stuff.
Yes, journaling is powerful. Research shows that writing about traumatic losses, particularly aspects you haven't talked much about, can significantly improve both emotional and physical health down the line.
What makes it effective?
The key seems to be focusing on those upsetting or undiscussed aspects, writing from your deepest thoughts and feelings without worrying about grammar or spelling, just getting it out. But it can be intense, so privacy is crucial, and it's often best introduced when someone feels relatively stable, not in the immediate chaotic aftermath.
Right.
One source mentioned Carol, who used journaling to process severe depression and childhood trauma. It became a tool for her to find self-respect and reconstruct her life narrative. Another, Andrew, used it after a job loss to process the anger and plan his next steps.
So that act of processing, putting words to it, is really helpful.
Indeed. Another really interesting strategy is working with linking objects.
Okay, what's that?
This is about consciously deciding how to integrate cherished belongings of the deceased into your ongoing life as a way of maintaining connection, rather than feeling pressured to discard everything.
So it's okay to keep things.
Absolutely. Remember Karen, whose son Kenny died? She wisely decided to keep some of his special toys in a display case, a visible reminder, while donating others that didn't hold the same meaning. It allowed her to continue her emotional bond with him in a tangible, healthy way.
It's not just physical objects, though. You mentioned legacy earlier.
Precisely. The concept expands beyond physical objects to more abstract linkages. Like carrying on a loved one's vision, their work, their values. Think of Martin Luther King III carrying on his father's civil rights advocacy. That's a powerful linking action.
Right.
These are ways of maintaining connection through action and legacy. The focus is on understanding the meaning of the connection for the bereaved person, rather than forcing some arbitrary idea of letting go.
Are there any downsides to this?
Well, the caution mentioned is that, like anything, cultivating connection could become problematic if taken to an extreme, maybe neglecting oneself or becoming a morbid preoccupation. The therapist's role isn't to push detachment, but to help the client understand the meaning and function of the bond, ensuring it's adaptive.
These narrative strategies really seem to provide active ways for people to engage with their grief, to shape their own story, rather than just passively waiting for time to heal.
Exactly. And in tying this back to our identity research on complicated grief, these strategies have really significant clinical implications.
How so?
Well, since we know CG is linked to that diminished sense of self, clinicians should try to assess which specific domains of a patient's identity seem to be missing or fractured due to the loss.
So figuring out the specific gaps.
Yes. One tool mentioned is the self-worth pie, a visual exercise where patients can depict the relative importance of different identity aspects work, family, hobbies, relationships, etc., and see where the loss has created a void.
That sounds useful.
And because CG is linked to fewer self-relevant activities and unclear preferences, therapeutic approaches like behavioral activation, which involves scheduling new, potentially rewarding activities, can be very beneficial. Also, complicated grief therapy itself often includes brainstorming value-consistent goals to help rebuild a sense of purpose.
So interventions specifically targeting those missing domains of self.
Exactly. Helping to restore or build new domains of self-concept.
And what about building new social connections? That seemed important in the identity research, too.
Crucially important. Our research indicates that strengthening social connections helps people untangle their identity from the deceased, lessening that fusion. And increased social support consistently reduces CG symptoms. So encouraging and facilitating new social bonds is key.
It sounds like identity ambivalence, that uncertainty about who you are after loss, while challenging, can also be seen as an opportunity.
That's a great way to put it. Meaning-oriented approaches frame it exactly like that, not just as a problem, but as a therapeutic opportunity to consciously revise personal meaning systems and build a new, meaningful life, incorporating the loss.
So with all this complexity, when should someone actually consider seeking therapy for grief? It sounds like there's maybe no immediate rush for everyone.
That's right. It's really important to normalize that immediate therapy isn't necessary or even helpful for everyone. Many people wait a year or more after a significant loss before seeking professional support. The early stages are often just about survival, getting through each day.
Okay, so when is it a good idea?
Therapy becomes particularly effective and supportive when you start to feel stuck. When the grief feels overwhelming month after month, or you feel numb, or you just feel like you're not making any progress and adapting to the loss.
And that idea of grief as a spectrum you mentioned earlier is helpful here, isn't it? The busy bee versus the frozen.
It really is. On one end, you might find yourself frantically springing into busy action, managing everything, organizing, maybe avoiding the emotions entirely.
Yeah, keeping busy.
On the other extreme, you might feel frozen, completely unable to function, overwhelmed by the emotions. Therapy can help find a balance.
Yeah.
For the overwhelmed person, it might be about breaking down huge tasks into tiny, manageable steps, just focusing on the next hour or the next small action. For those avoiding feelings, therapy might involve gently carving out protected time for emotions to surface, perhaps by engaging with emotional media, sad movies, music, and a safe space to carefully access those avoided feelings.
It's about finding that middle ground, that capacity to both feel and function.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance. And the most important message is you don't have to navigate this incredibly difficult journey alone. Seeking help when you need it is absolutely a sign of strength, not weakness.
What an incredible deep dive. We've really covered so much ground today, looking into the truly multifaceted world of grief. We've learned it's far more expansive than just the loss of a person, right? It extends to pretty much any significant change that disrupts our stability.
Yeah, and we've seen how our very sense of self, our identity, is so intricately intertwined with how we navigate these losses, sometimes leading to that profound identity confusion, especially in complicated grief.
And we've explored all those different models from the classic Kubler-Ross stages, understanding their limits, to the more dynamic oscillation of the dual process model.
And the crucial understanding from continuing bonds theory that maintaining a meaningful connection with those we've lost can actually be a healthy, adaptive part of the journey for many.
Right, challenging that old let-go mandate. And importantly, we found this rich toolkit of strategies, things ranging from quiet self-reflection through journaling and exploring metaphors.
All the way to active re-engagement with life, rebuilding routines, finding new activities, using narrative to reconstruct meaning.
These aren't just ways to cope, are they? They feel more like pathways forward, ways to actively adapt to a reality that has fundamentally changed.
That's a great way to think about it, pathways to reconstruct meaning. So maybe here's a final thought for everyone listening to consider.
Right.
If our identity is constantly being shaped, moment by moment, by both what we gain and what we lose, how might embracing the dynamic, evolving nature of grief, seeing it not as an ending, but as this continuous thread of meaning-making, how might that empower us?
Empower us to not just survive loss,
But maybe to fundamentally redefine what it means to live after loss. What new domains of self, what new strengths or perspectives might you discover or choose to recultivate in the face of change?